Hello, it is nice to be with you today. My name is Jen Brown, and I'm going to be speaking about the medical marijuana issue. There will be a bill run this session by Representative Forer, and they have run a bill the last couple sessions. And so I started going to some events where they were talking about this issue, and I was concerned about some of the things that I was hearing. I went to dental school, and I do have my Class 3 drug license, which means that I can prescribe Schedules 2 through 5. And I did have a lot of pharmacology classes, and I knew that there were some things that were being said that were not accurate. And so I started investigating this issue and doing some research on it so that I felt that I was prepared with some of the things that I wasn't sure about in my own mind. And so I thought today it would be good to say a few of the questions or the issues that are being talked about, and then we can go into a little bit of depth on those. But I'll start with saying, first of all, what kind of a drug is marijuana? Marijuana is considered a Schedule I drug. Now, Schedule I drugs mean that physicians cannot prescribe them. They have the highest abuse and addiction potential, and that's why, and they are not accepted for general medical use. And so the other thing about marijuana that's interesting is that it readily crosses our blood-brain barrier. And there's a lot of drugs that don't cross that. It takes a very certain kind of chemical compound in order for a drug to be able to cross over that protective barrier and to enter into our brain. Marijuana is very good at crossing the blood-brain barrier. And that is why it is a psychoactive drug. That is why you get a high after you inhale marijuana, is because it readily enters the brain and it exploits the pleasure center of the brain, called the nucleus accumbens, and causes a very high release of dopamine, which is the basis of addictions. And so let's talk about some other questions that people ask about marijuana. First of all, is medical marijuana different than street marijuana, or the kind of drug that's been the illicit material that's been around for decades and decades? The answer is it is not different. When we talk about medical marijuana and the bill that is going to be run this session, they are taking the raw plant and smoking it or putting it into cookies or brownies. It is the exact same drug that is found illicitly on the streets. Another question that is asked and that a lot of people are not sure about is, well, it would just be dispensed at the pharmacies, right? And that's what my mom thought. I was talking to her about it, and she said, well, I thought you would just go to the pharmacy and pick it up. The answer to that is it has to be dispensed at dispensaries because it is circumventing the FDA process. So how a drug normally, the process it normally goes through is that the FDA has a series of steps to ensure its safety. It has to have numerous clinical studies, and there has to be a way to guarantee the purity and the potency. So when you take a medication, you're always taking the same drug, always the same amount, and that can be carefully watched by your physician. Well, with medical marijuana, that process is not taking place. The state legislatures are bypassing the process that we've always used in this country to ensure safety, and they're allowing dispensaries to be set up. Now, when you go to a dispensary, there's no way to absolutely determine the amount of marijuana, the amount of THC in the marijuana, which is the psychoactive component. And so it makes it very dangerous because when you're smoking or ingesting the marijuana, there's a wide range of potency that is available at the dispensaries. And another thing about often the way marijuana is used at the dispensaries is through smoking it. Well, smoking a drug is very dangerous because it has detrimental consequences to our lungs. And so that's why we don't smoke medications that we get from the pharmacy, because it's dangerous. And so it's important for people to realize that what is going into this debate over medical marijuana, and a lot of people do not understand that it means dispensaries, that these are not FDA-approved medications. They are going through a completely different process. And another thing about the dispensaries is that is not necessarily something that you want in your neighborhood, because I know I've been working with a pharmacist on this topic. His name's Eric Loveridge, and he's in Bountiful, and it was interesting because he said his dad opened up Orchard Drug in 1959 and was one of the only pharmacists there, and he has so much knowledge about drugs. And we were talking, and he said that, marijuana, he's glad that it's not going to be in his pharmacy, that he can't legally have it in his pharmacy, because he said that he has been held at gunpoint 3 times. I could not believe that. I never thought of a pharmacist as being such a dangerous job. But he said, this is just going to bring out the drug seekers to these dispensaries. And he said, I have had so many problems with forged prescriptions. And he said, I know, I've been called into the courts so many times to testify, and I can usually tell when one's forged. And then I said to him, well, and of course they're not going to forge the dispensary prescription, are they? And so it just opens up a whole nother avenue for dishonesty, for criminality, and for ways to obtain a currently illegal drug. And it was interesting because I read a letter, I pulled a whole bunch of documentation, studies, I went into the EBSCO databases, and Eric pulled a whole bunch of research on the drug too. But I just found this. It was from a group of concerned citizens and concerned groups in California, including different faith groups, the National Council on Alcoholism and Drug Abuse, and a group of others. But they said, and this was them writing to the Sacramento County Board of Supervisors, they said there are too many dispensaries to distribute and too much cultivation to supply the needs of any legitimate users of medical marijuana. This situation of readily available marijuana raises a multitude of problems for our communities, from health concerns, exposure to youth, driving under the influence, to criminal violence, property damage, and community nuisances. And they requested imposing a total ban on all medical marijuana dispensaries because of the impacts it was having on the communities. And I definitely do not want one in Bountiful where I live. But this raises some of the other questions that are often asked, like, well, isn't marijuana going to solve our opioid problem? Well, let me answer that to you this way. We know that abuse of opioids is a very legitimate problem, but sometimes legitimate problems are used and solutions are given that are not legitimate answers to the problem. First of all, opioids are a Class II scheduled drug. They don't have inherently as much abuse and addictive potential, and they are not inherently as dangerous as marijuana and other illegal drugs. Number 2, opioids have a reversal called naloxone, that if somebody overdoses or somebody has a dependence problem, they do have a tool that they can use to help them. Eric the pharmacist I've been working with, talked very specifically to me that marijuana has absolutely no counter drug to help reduce the effects or to help with dependence. And so that's a reason why opioids are safer than marijuana, even though opioids do have an inherent abuse potential. And so would solving the opioid problem occur by using a more addictive, a more inherently dangerous, and a drug that is harder to treat addictions by substituting that drug for the opioid drug? Does that solve the problem that we have? And I'll leave you to answer to yourself. So another issue that I want to talk about is chronic pain. We have tremendous sympathy for people with chronic pain and for those that are struggling long-term with physical problems. And I talked to Eric a lot about this too and did a lot of research on this. First of all, marijuana is not substantively proven to be good at treating pain. When I talked to him about that, he said, marijuana isn't even very good at treating pain. Opioids, we know the mechanism of opioids. They actually reduce the way that nerves transmit the pain to our brain, and we understand that process very well. Well, marijuana is more anecdotal evidence that it is helping with chronic pain, and we know that it helps in the fact that it makes people high temporarily. Well, when you feel that, you're feeling disattached from your problem and disattached from your pain. But that doesn't mean that it's really working on the pain pathways the way that opioids are. And until there's reliable studies to prove it, then that's where it stands. And the other thing is that that people with chronic pain, giving them an even more addictive substance than we're already struggling with, oftentimes is not going to do them any good except for potentially cause them more abuse problems as well as not really sufficiently treating their chronic pain. And people are desperate for answers, so they're thinking, well, maybe we could just try it and see how it does. But the research is not there to back up that is the solution for chronic pain. And the opposite is that marijuana has very significant cognitive effects after you take it. It impacts your prefrontal cortex that you can't think the same, you can't drive the same, you can't do any kind of tasks that cause a lot of attentional thinking. And so there's a lot of dangers associated with marijuana, including other mental health risks and, of course, abuse. And so abuse and dependence. And so again, is this the solution for those that suffer with chronic pain? The information that we have absolutely does not support that. And so the last thing that I will leave you with is children. And it was interesting to me that another thing that's talked about with medical marijuana is, well, what about in epilepsy for kids? I don't know how many of you know, but Utah was actually the first state to pass a law that allowed for children with these epilepsies that have very much impacts their day-to-day life, that there's a path that they can get through the health department, an oil that is low in THC but high in CBD, which is another component in marijuana that does seem promising to help with epilepsy. Now, that pathway has already been carved out, as well as there's a drug that's in orphan drug status through the FDA that uses CBD from one of the chemical components of marijuana to treat these seizures. And so, again, if we're using this as a reason why full-scale medical marijuana with dispensaries should be used, that is not, we've already provided a path for that. We're addressing that separately, and there's a drug that is on the horizon that will treat it in addition to the oils, and the drug should be even more safer because the potency and the purity will be very much uniform through the FDA. And so that is not a reason why we should full-scale legalize medical marijuana. It has a tremendous impact on our youth, on the perception of drugs. And quite frankly, when you're smoking the raw plant or ingesting the raw plant, you you are just using marijuana, what's always been illegal. And so we need to be really careful to protect our societies and protect our kids and use the components in marijuana that are viable for medicinal purposes, but it has to be done the right way and through the right processes like the FDA. Thank you so much for your time today.